This week on American Forum, a look at the hot new biography of Richard Nixon with its best-selling author, Jack Farrell.
It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
For 6 years, our guest in this episode has been trolling presidential libraries and museums for material to write a new biography on a former president people can't seem to get enough of. Jack Farrell's book about the life of Richard Nixon, all 737 pages, including notes and index, is one-stop shopping to learn about our 37th president, who served from 1969 until 1974, when he became the only U.S. president in our history to resign from office. From the secret White House tapes that captured the nation in the 1970s, to a complicated personality bordering on paranoia, to his intense but distant love for his family, the Nixon presidency has been a gift that kept on giving for scholars and students of the complexity of human beings and the ways even extraordinary individuals can destroy themselves. This new book, Richard Nixon, The Life, breaks new ground. For years, scholars have argued about what is known as the Chennault affair, the alleged use by then-candidate Nixon of a back-channel connection to delay Vietnam War peace talks until after the 1968 election, thereby hurting Hubert Humphrey's chances to win the presidency and helping his own. Jack Farrell may have solved the puzzle. This is his third book. The other two were on former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill and famed attorney Clarence Darrow of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. Farrell was also a newspaper reporter at the Denver Post and the Boston Globe, where he worked on the paper's legendary Spotlight reporting team, the oldest continuously operating newspaper investigative journalism unit in the country. Jack Farrell, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
Let's go right into it's just a sliver of your book in some respects, but let's go right into the thing that's gotten the most attention. These notes that you found that speak to the question of whether Richard Nixon in 1968 may have, via Henry Kissinger and others, been involved in trying to delay a resolution of the Vietnam War out of fear that a successful peace negotiation would have helped his Democratic rival, and so the idea that he perhaps violated the law by encouraging a delay in the end of the Vietnam War. But so just go right to it. What did you find, and what does it tell us?
What I basically did is find a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that other historians have been putting together for decades, especially most recently Ken Hughes here at the Miller Center. And going through the most recently released files at the Nixon Library, I came upon a group of notes kept by Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff in the '68 campaign. And in them, he clearly records Richard Nixon telling him, keep Anna Chennault working on the South Vietnamese any way we can monkey wrench Lyndon Johnson's peace initiative. And what was significant about this was that Anna Chennault did approach the South Vietnamese. She was captured by U.S. intelligence agencies. Lyndon Johnson knew about this. He wanted to blow the whistle on Nixon, but there was never any confirmation that these words actually came out of Nixon's mouth. So now this last piece of the puzzle is in place, and we can say that Nixon not only knew about it or countenanced it, but he actually directed it.
Let's fill out the scene a little bit. It's 1968. Vietnam War has been raging. Opposition to the war is surging. LBJ has decided not to, has pulled back from running for re-election, largely because of what seemed to be out-of-control protests against the Vietnam War. Anna Chennault is originally a Chinese national, but a sort of Chiang Kai-shek, earlier era Chinese national, who married an American general. Am I remembering correctly? Yes, World War II era general.
The hero of the Flying Tigers.
And so is this sort of grand dame of a certain kind of political constituency in Washington, very busy in conservative circles. Yep. So how does this rather dramatic sounding figure, how does she come into the Nixon scene at all?
Yeah. Well, Nixon was an fierce anti-communist from the time he was in the House of Representatives and then the Senate. And then, of course, as vice president when he got well known for his red baiting. So Anna was a member of good standing in what was called the China Lobby, which was the Taiwanese Free China interest in Washington. She became a big fundraiser for Nixon. And as you said, Lyndon Johnson very desperately wanted to end the war that fall because he wanted that to be part of his legacy. He didn't want it to drag on. The Soviets got in contact with Lyndon Johnson and they said, we would like Humphrey to get elected. We will pressure the North Vietnamese to enter productive talks. That's the phrase that they used. And Johnson raised, his hopes were soaring. On the Nixon side, we now know that he directed it. We don't know for sure whether he was just reacting to what he thought was another Democratic dirty trick, or whether he had deeper motives about actually stalling the talks because he disagreed with them on policy reasons. The notes are kind of ambiguous in that regard, but very clearly he says this to Haldeman. Johnson calls him up, and there's this wonderful conversation on the Miller Center website where they're talking about this, and Nixon denies it.
Hello? Mr. President? Yes. This is Dick Nixon. Yes, Dick. I just want you to know that I got a report from Everett Dirksen with regard to your call, and I just went on Meet the Press, and I said that on Meet the Press that I had given you my personal assurance that I would do everything possible to cooperate both before the election and if elected after the election. And that if you felt, the Secretary of State felt that anything would be useful that I could do, that I would do it, that I felt Saigon should come to the conference table, that I would, if you felt it was necessary, go there or go to Paris, anything you wanted. I just wanted you to know that I feel very, very strongly about this, and any rumblings around about somebody trying to sabotage the Saigon government's attitude, there certainly have absolutely no credibility as far as I'm concerned.
Nixon denies it again to David Frost in the famous Frost-Nixon interviews. So he had built this sort of wall of deniability around it until this latest piece. Like I said, it's like when you go on vacation to the beach and for rainy days you spread out a jigsaw puzzle, and as you walk by it every once in a while you do a corner, you find a couple of pieces. And that's, I'm finding out that's how history is sometimes put together.
So I printed out one of the pages of notes that you found and that you include in the book, and so this is in Haldeman's handwriting. And so he says, keep Anna Chennault working on SVN, and that's South Vietnam, right? South Vietnam. And then in particular makes reference to on the 3 Johnson conditions.
Right.
So what's that referring to, and why is it that the other parties, we can see why Nixon, for this very cynical reason, wants to prevent the war from coming to an immediate end, but what's the leverage to the South Vietnamese?
Right, well remember I was talking about Nixon's motives. One of them obviously was to win the election, but he also had doubts that, fears that American strategic position would be undermined by what he feared would be a sellout. And so when he talks about the 3 Johnson conditions, is that Johnson had laid down in a public speech 3 different conditions that the North Vietnamese would have to meet before they engaged in peace talks with the United States. And in that process, over this time, all 3 conditions were met, unbeknownst maybe to Nixon. So there really was only one reason why the South Vietnamese didn't go. And Anna Chennault was captured by American eavesdroppers, telling the South Vietnamese ambassador, hold on, we're going to win, you'll get a better deal after Election Day. But one thing you do get to realize as you read Haldeman's notes over time is he has this pattern of writing next to him so you can see the different letters of where the orders come from, and then he puts a check when the order is carried out. He's a very, very thorough man. And I checked this with John Dean, who is one of the White House veterans who's still around. You know, he confirmed to me that what I had come to believe by looking at all these notes over the years, that this meant that this had been done. It wasn't just Nixon spouting off as he was,
so this
as he was
little
wont to
notation
do.
right here is telling us that this is an order, a directive from Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
And then the check mark says it's done.
And he has there's an exclamation point, and so yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's another note that you found in which there's reference to any other way to monkey wrench it,
Right.
and this term of to monkey wrench the talks. Is it possible that monkey wrench could have meant something other than
Sure.
than this?
Well, first of all, these are notes taken by Haldeman, so they're fragmentary in any case. But monkey wrenching, I took to mean, was monkey wrench the peace initiative. Whether or not Nixon's motives were just politically stop it or actually stop the peace talks, you could make the argument that, well, he's just talking about monkey wrenching the political side of it and not actually monkey wrenching the peace talks. But they're so closely intertwined that you really are picking at straws there if you try to make that argument.
Now, Ken Hughes, who you mentioned, another scholar on all this, he has postulated the idea that this is actually the beginnings of Watergate, that after Nixon is elected president, that because of these conversations, he's convinced there's a file at the Democratic National Committee offices that contains the proof of this, and that the reason the plumbers are sent in is to get that toxic file so that it can't be used against Nixon. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, the tapes are very suggestive. They're not, we still need one more piece of the puzzle that more specifically says what Nixon means when he talks about the bombing call. He had a way of getting these little catchphrases that collectively covered a wide range of things and could have meant the Chennault affair, could have just meant, they have a file about Johnson's wiretapping that we may want to get and we may want to use against Johnson. And in fact, he says that on one tape. But I think Ken's theory is pretty sound.
And we're not talking about a trivial development. That now there's no way for us to know for sure that the war would have ended in 1968 or 69, but it is the case that between the time of these events and when the last American troops are removed from Saigon, there's another 20,000 American casualties.
Deaths.
Yeah, deaths.
Deaths, yeah.
20,000 American lives are lost.
Yeah. And also millions of Asians.
Yeah.
I mean, this brings into play if the war had been stopped then, you wouldn't have had the Cambodian invasion. You might not have had the Cambodian genocide. You might not have had the South Vietnamese boat people and all the people that were lost in the fall of Saigon. So there's lots of big stakes. It's a series of hopping on stones across a stream to get there. But what I can say for sure is that Lyndon Johnson and his advisors believed in October 1968 that there was a peace deal that they could strike before he left office, and it was not a political trick like Nixon suspected just to get Humphrey elected. They really believed that they had peace at hand.
You write in the book, it is hard not to conclude that of all of Richard Nixon's actions in a lifetime of politics, this was the most reprehensible.
Yeah. Given what we learned later from the Church Committee and other investigations in the later 70s about the sins of previous presidents regarding burglary and wiretapping and assassinations of foreign leaders, Nixon's actions in Watergate actually become somewhat more acceptable, or there's an argument
normal
there that,
at least.
There's an argument there that he was a victim of a double standard. But this one is different, because this one is somebody saying, we're gonna meddle with a peace process that could end widespread suffering, that could cost us thousands of lives, American lives, as well as thousands of Vietnamese lives as well, and Cambodian lives as well.
How is it that these notes went undetected as long as all this?
Nixon was a very unique case because of Watergate. When he left office, the federal government seized his papers and his tapes, and they did not go with him to San Clemente. They did not go with him to a presidential library immediately. And he engaged in this long litigation, like I said, for 10, 15, 20 years, spent $2 million in legal fees to try to secure what he could. These were part of his political papers, and so they went to the foundation, and the foundation kept them after he died. Over time, we're liable to have a lot more National Security Agency memos or cables from their eavesdropping of what was going on in Saigon. And that's liable to show us that this had no effect on Tu whatsoever, that it was all internal politics that made him continue. And certainly the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese showed in the next 4 years that they were incredibly stubborn about coming to terms on a peace deal. Again, I don't think that because you want to argue that no great opportunity was lost, doesn't mean that what Nixon did was right or that it didn't happen. It did happen, and what he did was wrong, and that's why I think it's reprehensible, because he put his own political success ahead of what in the end turned out to be a very great loss of life.
What's the likelihood that that 30 years from now that things surface and we look back on this time and it turns out that whether it's those things I'm referencing or other ones, how much confidence can we ever have that we actually know the reality of anything that appears to be certain in our politics in the present?
I think that it's going to be more difficult for scholars of this period, because after Watergate there was no more tapes. After Iran-Contra there were no more presidential diaries. We're down to emails, and we saw what happened to emails in the Bush administration and the Hillary Clinton campaign. So basically you're talking about very, very guarded White House staffs, having seen all this age of scandal behind them, being very careful about what they collect. And I think it is going to be very hard. I think that people like Bob Woodward, when they go in with their tape recorder and they get everybody to talk for hours, are going to be invaluable resources. I think tweets and emails will be invaluable resources, but they can be, erased and made to disappear. So
the book's about much more than just that one incident. In terms of the broader depiction, a couple of reviews from other folks. One, John Coyne, Washington Times, saying, former Nixon speechwriter, said that you've got an overemphasis on the dark side. Same time period, not long ago, a review in the New York Times said some readers may find Farrell's portrait too sympathetic. So can both of those things be true at the same time?
Paradoxically, I think that they can. I think that if Nixon was a guy that attracted great loyalties from those who worked for him. It was amazing. It was one of the first things that struck me as I began to talk to them, was how protective they were of this poor guy who had so many personal problems and his peculiarities. And they believed they saw him as a tragic figure who was treated unfairly by the press and by history. So right away you begin to develop some sympathy and some empathy for Nixon. And many of the things that have been said about him over time by liberal journalists and scholars are flat out wrong. So that can be why.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, there's the shorthand for Nixon's experience in World War II was that he spent the war playing poker. Well, he did spend a lot of time playing poker, but he happened to spend it in the Solomon Islands in a combat zone playing poker, which is a different thing, a different thing entirely. There was a famous controversy about whether in his first election for Congress there were phone calls made by the Republican Party on election eve saying, that Jerry Voorhis, who was his opponent, that Jerry Voorhis is a communist. Well, there are enough people who say that happened that there probably were some phone calls made, and yet it was blamed on Nixon and Nixon's organization that they must have had a massive attempt with phone banks everywhere throughout the district, and that this is what swung the election. Well, no, what swung the election was Nixon's great performance in a candidate debate. So there's things like that that as you correct the record, then people say, okay, well you're going out of your way to being too nice to him. Once you get into the tapes and you start quoting the tapes, it's impossible not to reveal the dark side. This is a very twisted human being. Richard Nixon came back from his greatest triumph, opening China, and he's caught on the tape sitting there with Henry Kissinger saying, Henry, it all means nothing. The American people are a bunch of sheep. They look at that picture of me shaking hands with Mao and think it means something, and it really doesn't. It's all about power politics. This was all just a show, to get reelected. Nixon, at his most cynical, bad-mouthing his greatest accomplishment. And you find that time and time again. The tapes are going to be an immeasurable resource for scholars as they pore over, and more of the excerpted national security and personal stuff becomes available to them for another 50 years. They're just this amazing resource. Imagine if you had tapes of Jefferson and Hamilton going at it in front of George Washington over, forgiving the Revolutionary debt.
That sounds like a musical.
Yeah. And don't think I didn't think of that when it was happening. Even as a Jeffersonian, I sat there flinching at some of the portrayals of TJ. But to get back to the question, is that yes, this is a man who had a good side and he had a bad side. He had a light side and he had a dark side. He a very fascinating individual. He had this tragic flaw. He was afraid of things that would bring about his downfall, and as Henry Kissinger said, it was like a Greek tragedy where he went out and did the things that were guaranteed to bring about the result that he most feared. So you can be both light and dark, I think.
In the book, along these lines, there's a passage from a tape that I wasn't familiar with, that's from December 14, 1972. This is Nixon.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
That was 1 month after he won the biggest landslide in American history.
Yeah.
The man was just an unhappy individual, could not bring himself around. It was also while he was contemplating the Christmas bombing of Hanoi to savagely bring an end to the war. And he was also contemplating the fact that the Watergate cover-up was beginning to fray. So he was under a lot of pressure, and that's why that came out. But I think it really shows just his total inability to accept his own accomplishments.
I'm always a little skeptical of any comparisons between historical figures, and this press is the enemy quote is reminiscent of, but though to be fair to President Trump, he didn't say the press is the enemy. He named some specific members of the mainstream media, though later he added some conservative media outlets.
But he also
well.
took it further. He said the press is the enemy of the American
people. Right, exactly.
Which Nixon never said.
Yeah, but so as far as this comparison, one of these reviews, the New York Times, that I referred to a moment ago, says the similarities between Nixon and Trump leap off the page like crickets. That's a new expression to me, like crickets. Similar, it suggests in a boring way, perhaps. But what do you make of the Trump-Nixon comparison?
There's a vast number of coincidences. We've had massive protests. We've had allegations of eavesdropping. We've had a scandal involving a break-in at the DNC. We've had the press is the enemy. We've had ridicule of a press secretary. The biggest difference is that it's a Republican-controlled Congress. Nixon faced a Democratic-controlled Congress who was quite ready to launch. Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy were quite ready to launch an impeachment investigation of Nixon. So that's a big difference. Personally, they have the same sort of runaway presidential id. Nixon on the tapes and Trump on the tweets. There's a lot of echoes there that I hear. As individuals, very different personalities. Trump was born into a rich family. There's evidence of coldness in his childhood, but it was a comfortable childhood. Nixon had a Dickensian childhood with two brothers dying and the family's finances on a roller coaster throughout his childhood. He couldn't go to the Ivy League because his family couldn't afford to pay the transportation to the East Coast or to board him while he went to Yale or Harvard. A part of that whole, the press is the enemy, the professors are the enemy, the establishment is the enemy, comes from the feelings of resentment that these things were taken from him and that better educated, richer people like JFK had everything given to them, and Nixon had to scrap for it, and basically alone all his life. So there's that difference as well. But Nixon read books. Trump famously doesn't read books. Nixon wrote books. He was a genuine foreign policy intellectual. And in his wilderness years between losing in 60 and 62 and coming back in 68, Richard Nixon was reading Machiavelli, and he was treating himself to the great philosophers of old. And I don't see Trump doing that. Nixon very famously refused to play golf when he was president because it took too much time.
I like the idea of ending our conversation with an endorsement of an attribute of President Nixon. Thanks for being here. We hope you'll join us for future editions of American Forum, where our focus is always on the presidency and the challenges that face the nation. You've heard a lot today about the Nixon tapes. The Miller Center is the place on the internet that you can actually listen to them. There are about 3,400 hours of Nixon White House tapes. Once the property of the former president, they now belong to the U.S. government and to you, the American people, following numerous legal battles that began with the famous 1974 Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Nixon. The Miller Center has published over 200 highly detailed, heavily researched transcripts from those recordings. To listen to those tapes, go to our new website, millercenter.org, click on The Presidency, and then click on Secret White House Tapes. You will also find extraordinary conversations from the administrations of Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. You can watch American Forum on your local PBS affiliate, or to join our ongoing conversation, look for us on the Miller Center Facebook page or follow us on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. Jack Farrell is complicated. Read along with me on the screen. @J Aloysius, his first initial and his middle name. See you next week. Thank you. That's great.